Good evening, friends. Tonight we'll drift into a slow and gentle journey through Norse myths and shape-shifting tales. Dim your lights, settle under your blanket, let the noise of the day fade away. And if this calm journey helps you relax, feel free to tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. These are stories from the old Norse world, where gods walked between realms and magic was as common as morning frost. You might know some of these tales already, but tonight we'll explore them differently. We'll linger in the quiet moments, the in-between spaces where most storytellers rush past. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is in your city right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, whether you're settling in for the night or finding a peaceful moment in your busy day. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin. You've probably heard that Loki was a shapeshifter, but have you ever wondered what that actually felt like? Imagine having bones that could bend and stretch like warm clay, skin that could ripple and reform, a face that was never quite the same twice. This wasn't some quick magic trick with smoke and mirrors. When Loki changed shape, every cell in his body had to remember how to be something else entirely. Picture Loki on a quiet morning in Asgard, perhaps sitting by the well of Erd, watching his reflection shimmer and change without him even trying. His face might flicker between familiar features and something wilder, more ancient. The other gods had grown used to this restlessness in his appearance, the way his eyes might shift from green to amber when he was thinking deeply, or how his shadow sometimes seemed to have more limbs than it should. Shape-shifting wasn't just a trick Loki had learned, it was written into his very essence, like how water knows how to become ice or steam. His mother was Lofi, whose name meant Leafy Island, and his father Farboti, cruel striker. From birth, Loki carried the contradiction of gentle growth and destructive force, and his body reflected this constant tension between states of being. You could often find Loki practicing his transformations in the quiet hours before dawn, when most of Asgard still slept. He might start as himself, then let his hair grow longer and darker, his shoulders broader, his voice deeper. Then he'd shift again, smaller this time, more delicate, with different colored eyes and a laugh that sounded like silver bells. These weren't disguises exactly, but more like trying on different versions of who he might have been. The strangest part wasn't the physical changes, though those were remarkable enough. It was how his mind adapted to each new form. When he took the shape of a bird, he could feel the urge to build nests and follow migration patterns he'd never learned. As a fish, the deepest parts of lakes called to him with an ancient longing. Each transformation taught him something new about the world, about the secret lives of creatures who saw Asgard from entirely different perspectives. But there was one transformation that would change everything, though Loki didn't know it yet. It began with a problem that seemed simple enough. The gods needed a wall built around Asgard, something strong enough to keep out the giants who occasionally grew bold enough to threaten the realm. The work would take years, maybe decades, and none of the gods particularly wanted to spend their immortal existence hauling stones and mixing mortar. Then came the stranger, a master builder, who appeared at the gates of Asgard one autumn morning when the leaves were just beginning to turn. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they could crack mountains, and he made an offer that sounded too good to be true. He would build their wall, he said, the strongest fortification any realm had ever seen, and he would do it in just one winter. The gods gathered in their great hall to discuss this proposition. Odin sat in his high seat, his ravens perched silently on either side, while Frigg spun golden thread that caught the firelight. Thor lounged nearby, his hammer across his knees, looking skeptical, and Loki sat in the shadows, watching and listening, his face shifting subtly as his mind worked through possibilities. The builder's price was steep. He wanted the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freyja as payment. The gods laughed at first, thinking this was obviously impossible to agree to. But then Loki spoke up from his corner, his voice casual and thoughtful. What if they made the task truly impossible? What if they gave the builder just one season to complete the work, with no help from any man? The builder agreed, but with one condition. He could use his horse. Just his horse, nothing more. The gods looked at each other and shrugged. One horse, even a very good horse, couldn't make that much difference. How much stone could one animal haul? How much could it speed up the work? They agreed to the terms, thinking they were quite clever. That's when they met Svanhilfari, and realized they might have made a terrible mistake. This wasn't just any horse. Svanhilfari was enormous, with a coat like polished obsidian and eyes that seemed to hold starlight. More than that, he worked with an intelligence and strength that defied belief. He could haul stones the size of houses, work through the night without tiring, and seemed to understand exactly what the builder needed before being asked. Day after day you could see them working, the master builder directing and shaping, while Svarthilfari hauled massive blocks of stone as if they weighed nothing. The wall grew with impossible speed, each section more perfect than the last. By midwinter, when the work should have barely begun, it was already half finished. The gods began to worry, really worry. If the builder actually completed the wall, they would owe him the sun, the moon, and Freyja. Without the sun and moon, all the worlds would fall into eternal darkness and cold, and losing Freyja would mean losing love, beauty, and fertility from the world. The price of their magnificent wall might be the end of everything they held dear. That's when all eyes turned to Loki. After all, this had been his idea, his clever modification to the original bargain. Surely the shapeshifter could find a way out of the mess they'd created. Loki felt their stares like weight on his shoulders, saw the worry in Frigg's eyes, the growing anger in Thor's expression. And so, Loki began to plan, his mind already reaching toward a transformation, unlike any he'd ever attempted before. But what exactly did he have in mind? What shape could possibly solve a problem this enormous? And was he prepared for the consequences of a change that might alter not just his body, but the entire future of Asgard? You remember Svarthilfari from our last tale, that magnificent black stallion who could work miracles with stone and mortar. But let's slow down and really look at this creature, because there was something almost heartbreaking about his dedication to endless labor. Every morning before the sun rose, Svarthilfari would already be awake in the simple shelter the master builder had constructed. You could hear him stirring in the darkness, the soft sound of hooves on packed earth, the gentle whoosh of his breath in the cold air. He never needed to be woken or coaxed to work. Something deep in his nature drove him to rise before dawn, ready for another day of impossible tasks. His routine never varied. First he would drink from the clear stream that ran near their camp, the water so cold it sent small clouds of steam rising from his warm muzzle. Then he would stand quietly while the builder checked his harness, adjusting the thick leather straps that would help him pull loads that should have required a dozen ordinary horses. The harness itself was a work of art, crafted from leather so supple it seemed to flow like water, reinforced with metal fittings that gleamed like silver in the early light. The builder had made it specifically for Svarthilfari, taking careful measurements and adjusting every strap until it fit perfectly. You could see the care in those details, the way the builder's rough hands would gentle when he worked with his horse. Once harnessed, Svarthilfari would walk to wherever the day's stones waited. These weren't the sort of rocks you might find in a garden. They were massive blocks of granite and limestone, each one carefully selected by the builder for strength and beauty. Some were pale as winter moonlight, others dark as storm clouds. A few had veins of quartz running through them like frozen lightning. When Svarthilfari lowered his great head and leaned into his harness, something magical happened. His muscles would bunch and flow beneath his midnight coat. His hooves would find perfect purchase on the ground, and stones that should have been impossible to move would begin to slide forward as smoothly as boats on calm water. But it wasn't just his strength that made Svarthilfari remarkable, it was his intelligence. He seemed to understand the builder's vision for the wall before it was even explained. When they reached each section of the construction, Svarthilfari would position the stones exactly where they needed to go, sometimes nudging them with his nose to adjust their placement by mere inches. The gods would often come to watch them work, standing at a respectful distance and trying to understand how the impossible was becoming routine. Thor would lean on his hammer, his brow furrowed in concentration, clearly calculating whether even his divine strength could match what he was seeing. Odin would observe in his more subtle way, his one eye missing nothing, while his ravens flew overhead to get different perspectives on the construction. You could see the wall growing day by day, section by section, each part fitting together with a precision that spoke of both divine inspiration and careful planning. The stones weren't just stacked, they were woven together in complex patterns that made the wall both beautiful and incredibly strong. Some sections featured intricate geometric designs, while others had flowing curves that seemed to follow the natural contours of the land. And through it all, Svarthilfari worked with a contentment that was almost meditative. His breathing stayed steady and deep, even when pulling the heaviest loads. His dark eyes remained calm and focused, never showing strain or irritation. If horses could smile, you might have said Svarthilfari smiled while he worked, not from simple happiness, but from the deep satisfaction of doing exactly what he was meant to do. The builder, for his part, treated his horse with a respect that bordered on reverence. He never used whips or harsh words, never pushed for more speed than Svarthilfari was willing to give. Instead, he would speak to his horse in low, encouraging tones, often placing a gentle hand on the stallion's neck during their brief rest periods. During these breaks, you might have seen a different side of both builder and horse. The man would sometimes lean against Svarthilfari's warm flank, his eyes distant as he contemplated the work still to be done. The horse would lower his great head to crop whatever grass grew nearby, or simply stand in companionable silence, his ears swiveling to catch distant sounds from Asgard. These quiet moments revealed something important about their partnership. This wasn't just a master using a tool, or even a man working with a well-trained animal. There was understanding between them, a shared purpose that went beyond simple labor. They both took pride in the beauty they were creating, in the way each day brought them closer to completing something that would stand for ages. But as winter deepened, and the wall grew ever higher and stronger, the gods' appreciation for the beautiful craftsmanship was being overshadowed by growing dread. The work was proceeding too well, too quickly. At this rate, the builder would easily finish before spring, and then what would they do? Sometimes you could catch Loki standing at his window, watching Svarthilfari work in the distance. His expression during these moments was complex, part admiration for the magnificent creature, part calculation as he worked through possible solutions to their dilemma. The shapeshifter's fingers would drum against the stone windowsill, his mind clearly racing through options. What made Svarthilfari so impossibly strong? Was it magic, or simply the perfection of what a horse could be? And if someone wanted to slow down this relentless progress, what would they have to do? Would they have to find a way to separate the builder from his remarkable partner? If you're finding these quiet tales soothing, and if they're helping you unwind from your day, consider subscribing for more gentle stories like these. There's something peaceful about exploring these old myths at our own slow pace, isn't there? As you settle deeper into your blanket tonight, think about Svarthilfari's contentment in his work, the way he found joy in using his gifts fully. There's something to be said for that kind of purposeful dedication, even when, or perhaps especially when, the consequences might be more complicated than they first appear. We've seen how Loki was planning something, watching Svarthilfari with those calculating eyes. But before we discover what the trickster had in mind, let's step back and really understand the gift, or perhaps curse, that made such wild plans possible. Loki's shapeshifting wasn't like putting on different clothes or masks. When he changed form, everything changed. His thoughts, his instincts, even his memories seemed to shift and adapt. Imagine your mind suddenly filled with new knowledge you'd never learned, your body craving foods you'd never tasted, your eyes seeing colors that had no names. You might wonder how such an ability first manifested. The stories say it began in childhood. Back when Loki was still trying to figure out which parent he resembled more, he'd wake up some mornings with slightly different colored hair, or find that his reflection in still water showed features that weren't quite the same as the day before. At first, these changes were small and involuntary, the way a young person's voice might crack when they're nervous. Except Loki's entire appearance would flicker when he felt strong emotions. Joy might make his eyes brighter, and his smile wider. Fear could make him seem smaller, more fragile. Anger sometimes brought out features that were sharper, more dangerous, hinting at the giant blood that flowed through his veins. His foster family in Asgard learned to read these changes like others might read facial expressions. When Loki's hair started to darken and curl more than usual, they knew he was feeling mischievous. When his features became more delicate and ethereal, he was probably sad or lonely. And when his eyes took on that particular golden gleam, they knew to expect surprises. But conscious shapeshifting, deliberately taking on new forms, that took years of practice and more than a little pain. Young Loki would spend hours in secluded groves, trying to make his fingers grow longer, or his hair change color through sheer force of will. The early attempts often left him dizzy and exhausted, with partial transformations that looked more frightening than intended. Picture him at 15, sitting by a quiet pond, concentrating so hard his face turned red with effort as he tried to make gills appear behind his ears. Or at 20, standing in a moonlit clearing, managing to sprout feathers along his arms before collapsing from the strain of maintaining such an unnatural change. The breakthrough came, as breakthroughs often do, by accident. Loki had been fleeing from one of Thor's more enthusiastic wrestling matches. The thunder god didn't always remember that others weren't quite as sturdy as he was. running through the forest with a possibly broken rib, desperate to escape before Thor realized he'd caused actual harm. Loki wished desperately that he could fly away from all of it. And suddenly, he could. His bones became hollow and light, his arms sprouted magnificent black wings, his vision sharpened until he could see individual leaves from impossible heights. More importantly, his mind filled with instinctive knowledge of wind currents and navigation. For the first time, a transformation felt completely natural, like he'd finally remembered something he'd always known how to do. From that day forward, shapeshifting became easier, more intuitive. Loki learned that the key wasn't forcing his body to change, but rather convincing it to remember other ways of being. Every creature he discovered was already inside him somehow. He just had to find the right mental pathway to bring each one forward. As a salmon, he could feel the magnetic pull of his birthplace calling him upstream. As a seal, the deepest ocean trenches felt like home. When he took the form of a fly, the world became a fascinating landscape of air currents and chemical signals invisible to larger creatures. But perhaps the most unsettling transformations were when he became other people, not just changing his appearance but taking on their mannerisms, their ways of speaking, even their memories and emotions. He could become so convincingly someone else that sometimes it took effort to remember who he actually was underneath it all. You could often find Loki in the Great Hall of Asgard, sitting quietly in some corner, wearing a face nobody recognized. He might spend an entire evening as a visiting dignitary from Alfheim, complete with pointed ears and an otherworldly accent, just to see how differently people treated him. Or he'd become a serving girl with braided hair and worn hands, listening to conversations that stopped abruptly when his usual self entered a room. These experiments taught him things about his fellow gods that perhaps he would have been happier not knowing. He learned who spoke kindly to servants, and who didn't notice them at all. He discovered which of the seemingly noble Aesir had petty jealousies and small cruelties they kept carefully hidden. He heard his own name discussed in ways that sometimes stung more than he expected. But the transformations also showed him beauty and wonder that his normal perspective couldn't access. As a butterfly, he experienced flowers as entire worlds of color and scent. As a wolf, he felt the deep satisfaction of pack loyalty and the thrill of the hunt. Each form taught him something new about the complex web of existence that connected all living things. The strangest part was how each shape felt completely real while he inhabited it. When Loki was a bird, the idea of walking on two legs seemed as foreign and awkward as flight felt to his normal form. When he was a fish, the concept of breathing air was almost unimaginable. Each transformation was a complete reality unto itself. And now, watching Svarthilfari work with such magnificent strength and dedication, Loki's shape-shifting mind was already reaching toward a solution that would require perhaps his most ambitious transformation yet. But what form could possibly distract such a focused, powerful creature? What shape could solve Asgard's problem without creating even worse consequences? As Loki stood at his window that night, his reflection flickering between his familiar features and something else, something with a longer mane and different eyes, he was already beginning to understand what he might have to become. The question was whether he had the courage to attempt a transformation that would change, not just his body but possibly his entire destiny. You've seen how Loki was contemplating his most dangerous transformation yet. But let's step back and really understand the terrible bind the gods had gotten themselves into. Sometimes the worst problems start with the most reasonable-sounding solutions. The original idea for a wall around Asgard hadn't come from desperation, but from simple common sense. The realm of the gods was beautiful beyond description. Crystal halls that caught and reflected light in impossible ways, gardens where golden apples grew that granted eternal youth, fountains that sang with voices like silver bells. But beauty, as the gods had learned through hard experience, often attracted unwanted attention. The giants, particularly, had a habit of showing up at the most inconvenient times. Not all giants were hostile. Some were quite reasonable, even friendly, but others looked at Asgard's wonders with undisguised longing, and a few had grown bold enough to make demands or threats. A proper wall, everyone agreed, would serve as both protection and a clear statement of boundaries. You could picture the gods in their great council chamber, discussing the project with the careful deliberation that immortal beings could afford. Odin sat in his high seat, Hulitzgalf, from which he could see all the 9 worlds. His expression was thoughtful as various gods offered their opinions on materials, height, and defensive features. Frigg, wise in her own right, pointed out that any wall worth building would require enormous amounts of stone and mortar. The work could take decades, maybe centuries, if they wanted something truly impressive. Thor, ever practical, wondered aloud whether they might simply threaten any troublesome giants with his hammer, a solution that had worked well in the past. But Odin shook his head slowly. Mjolnir was indeed powerful, but threats only worked as long as you were willing to carry them out. Did they really want to spend eternity fighting every giant who tested their resolve? Wouldn't it be better to have a barrier that spoke for itself, that said clearly and peacefully that Asgard was not open to uninvited visitors? The debate continued for hours, with various gods suggesting different approaches. Some wanted to hire workers from Midgard. Humans were always eager to please the gods, and the work would give them purpose. Others thought they should do the construction themselves, as a communal project that would bring Asgard together around a shared goal. That's when the stranger appeared at their gates. You have to understand, Asgard didn't get many unexpected visitors. The Rainbow Bridge was guarded by Heimdall, whose senses could detect a mouse stirring 9 worlds away. For someone to simply show up unannounced was unusual enough to draw immediate attention. The master builder was impressive in the way that truly skilled craftsmen often are, not flashy or boastful, but carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with his hands and his mind. His clothes were well made but practical, his tools were obviously well used and carefully maintained, and his voice was steady and calm when he made his incredible offer. He would build them a wall, he said, stronger and more beautiful than anything they could imagine. It would be tall enough to discourage giants, thick enough to withstand any assault, and lovely enough to be a source of pride rather than mere necessity. And he would do it all in one winter, just one season of work. The gods exchanged glances around their council chamber. Such speed seemed impossible, even with divine help. But the builder's confidence was compelling, and his price, while steep, had a certain logic to it. He wanted payment that matched the magnitude of what he was offering, nothing less than the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freyja. At first, the demand seemed so outrageous as to be almost insulting. The sun and moon weren't possessions to be traded. They were fundamental to the functioning of all the worlds. Without their light and warmth, everything would die in cold and darkness. And Freyja, she was not only beloved but essential, governing love, beauty, fertility, and war. Losing her would drain the color and joy from existence itself. But then Loki spoke up from his corner, his voice carrying that particular tone of amused calculation that the other gods had learned to be wary of. What if, he suggested, they modified the terms just slightly? What if the builder had to complete the work in just one winter, with no help from any man? Surely that would make success impossible, allowing them to get some impressive work done without actually having to pay the full price. The suggestion sparked intense debate. Some gods worried about the ethics of making an agreement they hoped would fail. Others pointed out that the builder was free to refuse the modified terms if he thought them unfair, and a few wondered aloud whether Loki's cleverness might be leading them into deeper trouble rather than out of it. But the builder himself seemed untroubled by the modification. He listened to their counter-proposal with the same calm attention he'd shown throughout the negotiations. When they finished explaining the new terms, he nodded slowly and made only one addition of his own. He wanted permission to use his horse. Just his horse. No other helpers, no magical assistance, no special tools or divine intervention. Simply him, his skills, and his animal companion. The gods looked at each other and tried not to smile too. Obviously, how much difference could one horse make, even a very good one? The modification seemed reasonable, even generous. And so the bargain was struck, with all the formal ceremonies that such agreements required. Oaths were sworn, terms were repeated and confirmed, and hands were shaken in the ancient manner that made contracts binding even among gods. The builder would have one winter to complete his impossible task, aided only by his horse, and if he succeeded, he would claim prizes that would unmake the world. You can imagine how confident the gods felt as they retired to their halls that night. They had been clever, they thought. They would get some excellent construction work done, perhaps even a respectable beginning to their wall, and when spring came and the work remained unfinished, they could fairly say the builder had failed to meet his side of the bargain. But as you already know, they had seriously underestimated both the builder and his remarkable horse. And now, with winter drawing to a close and the wall nearing completion, the true cost of their cleverness was becoming terrifyingly clear. Had they been outsmarted by the very craftsmen they thought they were deceiving? And what would happen to all the worlds if they actually had to honor their bargain? The gods had made their impossible bargain, confident in their cleverness, only to watch their certainty crumble as the wall grew higher and stronger each day. Now, with spring approaching, and the builder's success seeming inevitable, all eyes had turned to Loki. After all, this had been his modification to the original deal, his supposedly clever solution that was now threatening to destroy everything they held dear. You could feel the weight of their expectation pressing down on the shapeshifter like a physical thing. Every morning brought new progress on the wall, and every evening brought new pressure from his fellow gods. Thor's glares grew more menacing daily. Odin's single eye seemed to follow him wherever he went. Even gentle Frigg looked at him with worry that bordered on accusation. Loki spent long hours pacing his chambers, his reflection flickering constantly in the polished surfaces as his control over his appearance wavered with his anxiety. Sometimes he looked like himself, sometimes like a stranger, and occasionally like something that wasn't quite either. His mind raced through possibilities, rejecting one plan after another as too dangerous, too uncertain, or simply too late. The obvious solutions wouldn't work. He couldn't simply attack the builder, that would violate the sacred oath they had sworn, bringing down curses that would make their current problem seem trivial. He couldn't sabotage the construction directly for the same reason, and he couldn't convince the builder to abandon his work, not when the man was so close to claiming the most valuable prizes in all the 9 worlds. That left only one option, and it was perhaps the most dangerous transformation Loki had ever contemplated. He would have to become something that could distract Svartalfari from his work. Not just any distraction, but something so compelling that even the most dedicated horse would abandon his duties to pursue it. The night Loki finally made his decision, you could have found him standing at the edge of the forest that bordered the construction site. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light that made the world look magical and strange. In the distance he could hear the sounds of Svartalfari and his master working through the night. The scrape of stone on stone, the gentle encouragement of the builder's voice, the steady rhythm of incredible labor. Loki closed his eyes and reached deep into himself. Deeper than he'd ever gone before. He wasn't just changing his appearance this time, or even his species. He was changing his fundamental nature, becoming something that would call to Svartalfari's deepest instincts in ways the stallion couldn't possibly ignore. The transformation began slowly, like all of Loki's most profound changes. His bones started to reshape themselves, growing longer in some places, shorter in others. His spine curved and extended. His limbs altered their proportions. His skin prickled as his hair thickened and spread, becoming a coat of the softest, most lustrous white, a color that would glow like starlight in the darkness. But the physical changes were only part of it. As his body became equine, his mind filled with new knowledge, new instincts, new desires. He understood suddenly the complex social structures of wild horse herds, the intricate dances of courtship and competition, the irresistible urge to run free under the open sky. More than that, he became aware of scents and sounds he'd never noticed as a god. The wind carried information about weather patterns, other animals, and the emotional states of creatures miles away. His hearing sharpened until he could detect the heartbeats of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of grass growing, the distant conversations of night birds. When the transformation was complete, Loki looked down at his new form with a mixture of amazement and apprehension. He was magnificent, a mare of impossible beauty, with a coat like fresh snow and a mane that seemed to capture moonlight and hold it. His legs were long and elegant but clearly built for speed, his neck arched with natural grace, his eyes dark and intelligent and wild. But even as he admired the perfection of his new shape, part of Loki's mind worried about what he was becoming. This wasn't just a disguise he could shed when convenient. Shapeshifting this profound changed the transformer as much as their appearance. Would he remember to change back? Would he want to? And what if his plan worked too well? He didn't have long to worry. As he stepped from the shadow of the trees into the moonlit clearing where the construction continued, Svartalfari's head snapped up immediately. The great stallion's nostrils flared as he caught an unfamiliar scent. His ears swiveled forward, and his dark eyes fixed on the white mare who had appeared so suddenly and silently. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Svartalfari stood frozen in his traces, a massive stone block half lifted, his entire attention focused on this unexpected vision. The builder, bent over his careful measurements, didn't notice immediately that his partner had stopped working. Then Loki took a single step forward, his hooves making the softest sound on the forest floor, and everything changed. Svartalfari's whinny echoed across the clearing, not the sound of a working animal, but the call of a stallion who had just seen something that made his blood sing with possibilities he'd forgotten existed. The builder looked up from his work, confusion clear on his face as he tried to understand why his dedicated partner had suddenly abandoned their shared labor. His eyes followed Svathilfari's gaze to the edge of the clearing, where a white mare stood like something out of a dream, beautiful and wild and free. These old stories have such layers to them, don't they? If you're enjoying the slower exploration of Norse mythology, and if these tales are helping you find a moment of calm in your day, please consider subscribing. There's something wonderful about discovering new depths in familiar stories. And in that moment, as Svathilfari strained against his harness and called out to the mysterious mare, Loki realized that his desperate plan was working. But he also began to understand that some transformations carry consequences that extend far beyond the moment of change. What would happen when one of the most powerful stallions in all the worlds decided to pursue what he desired more than duty? You remember that moment, when Svathilfari first saw the white mare, how his entire world shifted from dedication to work towards something far more primal and compelling. What happened next was perhaps the most elaborate chase scene in all of Norse mythology, though you wouldn't recognize it as such from most tellings. This wasn't a brief pursuit, but a slow, complex dance that lasted through the night and into the dawn. Loki, in his mare form, stood at the edge of the clearing for just a moment longer, letting Svathilfari's dark eyes drink in every detail of his appearance. The white coat that seemed to gather moonlight, the elegant arch of neck and tail, the way he held himself with wild grace that spoke of freedom rather than labor. Then, with the instincts of his new form guiding him, Loki turned and disappeared into the forest. The effect on Svathilfari was immediate and overwhelming. Here was a stallion who had spent months focused entirely on his work, who had found deep satisfaction in the rhythm of hauling stone and building walls. But now, suddenly, all those careful habits and trained behaviors were swept away by something much older and stronger than duty. You could see the exact moment when Svathilfari made his choice. His muscles bunched and strained as he fought against his harness, the thick leather creaking under the pressure. The builder called out in alarm, trying to calm his partner, but Svathilfari was beyond hearing human words. With a sound like breaking thunder, he snapped the traces that held him and plunged into the forest after the white mare. The chase that followed wound through the darkest parts of the woods, along paths that seemed to appear just when they were needed and disappear moments after the horses passed. Loki led the way with an intuition that surprised him. His mare's mind knew exactly how to move through thick underbrush, how to leap fallen logs, how to find footing on treacherous slopes. Behind him, Svathilfari crashed through the forest with the power of a landslide, his hooves striking sparks from stone outcroppings, his breath steaming in the cold air. But for all his size and strength, he couldn't quite catch the white mare who danced ahead of him, always just close enough to keep hope alive, always just far enough away to maintain the pursuit. As they ran, Loki found himself caught up in instincts he'd never experienced before. Part of his mind remained calculating, focused on his mission to delay the wall's completion, but another part, the part that was truly mad, began to enjoy the chase for its own sake. There was something intoxicating about being pursued by such a magnificent stallion, something that made his pulse quicken with more than just the effort of running. The forest seemed to stretch and bend around them, paths leading deeper into wilderness than should have existed so close to Asgard. They galloped through groves where ancient trees whispered secrets in languages older than the gods, across streams that sang with voices like distant harps, over hills where strange flowers bloomed only in moonlight. Svathilfari's calls echoed through the night, sounds of longing and determination and wild hope. He had never made such sounds while working, had never shown such passion for anything as he now showed for catching the elusive white mare. His entire being was focused on this pursuit, with an intensity that made his previous dedication to construction seem mild by comparison. Hours passed, though time seemed to move strangely in the deep woods. Sometimes the chase would slow to a walk, with Loki picking his way carefully through difficult terrain, while Svathilfari followed at a respectful distance, as if understanding that patience might succeed where force had failed. Other times they would burst into full gallop again, racing through clearings and leaping obstacles with a joy that had nothing to do with their original purposes. Back at the construction site, the master builder stood helpless beside his abandoned tools and half-finished work. Without Svathilfari, he was just a man with ambitious plans and no way to fulfill them. He called into the forest, his voice growing hoarse, but received no answer except distant echoes of hoofbeats moving ever farther away. As dawn approached, painting the sky with pale colors that filtered down through the forest canopy, both horses began to tire. Not physically, They were both creatures of divine power, capable of running much longer than ordinary animals, but emotionally, the intensity of the chase was exhausting. Svarthilfari's calls became less frequent, more questioning. Loki's responses, for he had begun to answer with soft whinnies of his own, grew more complex, carrying meanings he didn't entirely understand. They found themselves in a meadow neither had seen before, carpeted with grass so green it seemed to glow in the early light. A stream wandered through it, clear and cold and singing softly to itself. Ancient standing stones marked the edges of the space, weathered monuments to forgotten purposes that somehow made the place feel sacred. Here, finally, they stopped running. Svarthilfari approached slowly, his head lowered respectfully, no longer the relentless pursuer, but something gentler and more uncertain. Loki stood trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming complexity of what was happening to him. His mare's instincts were telling him things his god's mind wasn't prepared to understand. They stood together in that enchanted meadow as the sun rose fully, two magnificent horses who had found each other in the strangest of circumstances. Svarthilfari's coat was dark with sweat from the long chase, but his eyes were bright with satisfaction. He had caught his prize, though perhaps it would be more accurate to say that she had finally allowed herself to be caught. And Loki? Loki was discovering that shapeshifting carried risks he had never fully appreciated. The longer he remained in any form, the more that form's nature influenced his thoughts and desires. What had begun as a calculated deception was becoming something much more complicated, much more real, and much more dangerous to his sense of who he actually was. But the immediate goal had been achieved. The wall's construction had stopped. Without Svarthilfari, the master builder could never complete his impossible task before spring arrived. Asgard was safe from having to pay the terrible price they had promised. The question now was whether Loki would be able to extract himself from the situation he had created, or whether some transformations carried consequences that lasted far longer than anyone expected. After that long night of pursuit through the enchanted forest, a strange quiet settled over Asgard. The constant sounds of construction, the scraping of stone, the calls of the master builder directing his work, the steady rhythm of Svarthilfari's hooves, all of that had simply stopped. In its place came a silence that was both relief and uncertainty. You could walk through the halls of Asgard during those days, and hear things that had been lost beneath the noise of building. The soft conversations of servants as they went about their daily tasks. The distant sound of Frigg's spinning wheel, creating threads that sparkled like captured starlight. The gentle splash of fountains in courtyards that had been forgotten during the urgency of the wall project. The master builder, abandoned by his remarkable partner, had tried for several days to continue the work alone. You might have seen him in those first mornings after Svarthilfari's disappearance, standing beside stones that would have been easy for his horse to move, but were impossible for human strength to manage. His calls echoed through the forest, growing more desperate each day, but no answering whinny came back. Eventually he packed his tools with the careful movements of someone who understood that his grand plan had failed. The gods watched from a distance as he loaded his cart with chisels and measuring rods, hammers and levels, all the implements of his impressive craft. There was something both dignified and heartbreaking about the way he worked, making no complaints or accusations, simply accepting that circumstances had changed beyond his control. When he finally departed through Asgard's gates, walking beside his cart like any ordinary craftsman heading home from a job, the gods felt a mixture of relief and guilt. They had what they wanted, freedom from an impossible bargain, but they had gained it through deception, and the taste of that victory was more complicated than they had expected. The unfinished wall stood as a reminder of how close they had come to disaster. It was magnificent, even incomplete, stronger and more beautiful than anything they could have built themselves. But it also served as a monument to the dangers of cleverness without wisdom, of making bargains they didn't fully understand. And where was Loki during all of this? The shapeshifter had vanished completely, leaving behind no trace of where he had gone, or when he might return. His chambers stood empty, his usual chair in the great hall remained vacant. His voice was absent from the councils where decisions were made. For the first time in memory, Asgard existed without the Trickster's presence. Some gods worried that something terrible had happened to him. Thor, despite their frequent conflicts, found himself listening for Loki's distinctive laugh during feasts, missing the way his brother could turn any gathering into something unpredictable and lively. Odin, wise enough to suspect at least part of the truth, simply waited with the patience of someone who understood that some problems take time to resolve. The seasons turned with their usual rhythm, spring giving way to summer, summer fading toward autumn. The incomplete wall became covered with flowering vines, as if nature itself was trying to soften the harsh reminder of their near catastrophe. Birds nested in the gaps between stones, and small creatures made homes in the spaces that would have been filled with mortar. During this time, if you knew where to look, and had eyes sharp enough to see through illusion, you might have glimpsed a white mare grazing in distant meadows, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by a great black stallion. They moved through the wild places between the worlds, following paths that existed only for those who lived outside the normal boundaries of civilization. But these sightings were rare and uncertain, more like dreams than definite observations. Most of the time, the two horses remained hidden in places where even the god's sight could not easily reach, lost in forests that were older than memory, or running across plains that existed in the spaces between established realms. The other gods developed new routines to fill the silence Loki's absence created. Frigg took over some of his duties in mediating disputes, her gentle wisdom proving surprisingly effective at solving problems that had once required the trickster's more complex approaches. Thor found himself making more of an effort to think before acting, perhaps realizing that he had relied more than he knew on his brother's counsel. Balder, beautiful and beloved Balder, seemed somehow dimmer without Loki's presence to create contrast. It was as if light needed shadow to define it properly, and without the trickster's darker energy, even joy felt muted and incomplete. The other gods began to understand, perhaps for the first time, how essential Loki's contradictions were to the balance of their world. But the most significant change was in the quality of time itself. With Loki gone, there were fewer surprises, fewer sudden shifts in plan or perspective. Days followed each other with predictable rhythm, each one much like the last. It was peaceful in a way that should have been pleasant, but instead felt somehow empty, like a song with all the harmonies removed. And still the seasons turned, autumn bringing its own quiet beauty to Asgard. The trees that grew near the unfinished wall turned gold and red, their leaves eventually falling to carpet the abandoned construction site. Snow came early that year, covering everything in pristine white that made the realm look clean and new, as if the past year's complications had been erased. But underneath that peaceful surface, something was changing, growing, developing toward a conclusion that would surprise everyone involved. In the hidden places where reality bends toward possibility, where transformation carries consequences that extend far beyond intention, the future was taking shape in ways that no amount of divine wisdom could have predicted. The gods had learned to live with Loki's absence, but they had not yet discovered what his sacrifice, for that's what it was, really though, none of them understood it yet, would ultimately bring into the world. Some gifts take time to mature, and some changes require patience that even immortal beings find difficult to maintain. After months of mysterious absence, after seasons of silence and waiting, Loki finally returned to Asgard, but he didn't come alone, and he didn't come unchanged. If you had been watching from the walls of the Great Hall on that crisp winter morning, you would have seen a sight that defied every expectation and assumption about the nature of gods and transformation. Loki approached the gates in his familiar form, tall, sharp-featured, with that particular way of moving that suggested barely contained energy, but beside him walked something unprecedented, a foal like no creature that had ever existed in any of the 9 worlds. 8 legs carried him with a grace that made ordinary horses look clumsy by comparison, each limb perfectly proportioned and coordinated with the others in a way that seemed both natural and impossible. The foal's coat was grey as storm clouds, with a mane and tail that seemed to catch light and hold it, creating an almost luminous effect. His eyes were dark and intelligent, holding depths that suggested wisdom far beyond his apparent youth. When he moved, there was something in his gait that spoke of speeds and distances that normal horses could never achieve, of journeys across impossible terrain, and through spaces that existed between the established worlds. You could see immediately that this was no ordinary animal. Every line of his body spoke of divine heritage, of power that had been bred from the impossible union of magic and will. His 8 legs didn't seem strange or awkward. Instead, they created a kind of liquid motion that was mesmerizing to watch, like seeing poetry written in living form. The guards at Asgard's gates stood frozen, uncertain how to react to this unprecedented situation. Loki had returned, yes, but what was this creature he brought with him, and why did the trickster's expression carry such a complex mixture of pride and uncertainty, love and fear? Word of their arrival spread quickly through the halls of Asgard. Gods emerged from their chambers and duties to witness something that had never happened before. Loki returning from a mysterious absence with a companion that challenged every assumption about what was possible, even in a realm where the impossible was routine. Odin was among the first to arrive, his single eye taking in every detail of the extraordinary foal. The All-Father's expression was unreadable, but you could see the wheels of divine wisdom turning behind his gaze. Here was a creature of obvious power and potential, born from circumstances that were clearly more complex than they appeared. Thor came next, his hammer forgotten at his side, as he stared at the eight-legged foal. The god of thunder had seen many strange things in his travels through the 9 worlds, but nothing quite like this. There was something in the young horse's bearing that reminded him of Svathilfari's incredible strength, but refined and elevated to an entirely new level. Frigg approached with the gentle curiosity of someone who understood that great changes often came in unexpected packages. She extended her hand slowly, allowing the foal to catch her scent and decide whether to accept her presence. When he stretched his neck forward and allowed her to stroke his nose, she smiled with genuine warmth. But it was Loki's behavior that truly revealed the depth of what had happened during his absence. The trickster, usually so confident and controlled, showed an uncertainty that bordered on vulnerability as he watched the god's reactions to his companion. His hand rested protectively on the foal's neck, and his voice carried unfamiliar notes of defensiveness when he finally spoke. "This is Sleipnir," he said simply, the name rolling off his tongue with a mixture of pride and something that might have been wonder. "He is my son." The silence that followed was profound. Gods, who had thought they understood the limits of possibility, found themselves confronting something that redefined those boundaries. Loki, the shapeshifter, the trickster, the one who walked between categories and defied easy classification, had somehow become a mother and brought forth a son, unlike any creature that had ever lived. You could see in Sleipnir's movements and bearing that he was no ordinary foal, despite his apparent youth. When he walked, his 8 legs created complex rhythms that somehow resolved into perfect harmony. When he looked at something, his gaze held the kind of focused intelligence that suggested he was not just observing but analyzing, understanding, preparing for some future purpose. The physical impossibility of his existence was matched by the beauty of his form. Each of his 8 legs was perfectly shaped, neither too long nor too short, each hoof precisely sized and positioned, his neck arched with natural pride, his ears were alert and mobile, his tail flowed like liquid silver when he moved. But beyond the physical marvel, there was something else about Sleipnir that caught the attention of anyone who watched him carefully. He moved with a confidence that suggested he already understood his own capabilities, already knew that he was destined for things that ordinary horses could never achieve. There was purpose in his bearing, as if he had been born not just to exist but to fulfill some specific role in the complex web of fate that connected all things. As the initial shock of their arrival faded, practical questions began to arise. Where would Sleipnir stay? What did 8-legged foals eat? How fast could something with that many legs actually run? And underlying all these immediate concerns was the deeper question that everyone was thinking, but no one quite dared to ask. What did this mean for the balance of power and possibility in Asgard? Loki seemed to read these unspoken questions in their faces. His expression softened as he watched Sleipnir explore his new surroundings, the young horse's curiosity evident in every movement. "He will need space to run," the trickster said quietly, "and he will need purpose. He was born for great things, though I'm not entirely sure what those things will be." That admission, that even Loki didn't fully understand what he had brought into being, sent a small shiver through the assembled gods. They were used to the trickster having plans within plans, schemes that extended far beyond what anyone else could see. But this felt different, more like destiny unfolding than manipulation being executed. And as they watched Sleipnir take his first steps into Asgard proper, his 8 legs carrying him with impossible grace across the courtyard stones, they began to sense that something fundamental had changed in their world. This was not just the arrival of a new creature, but the beginning of stories that none of them could yet imagine. You might think that Sleipnir's arrival in Asgard would have caused chaos or confusion, but in fact, the 8-legged foal settled into divine society with remarkable ease. He had inherited something from both his parents, Loki's adaptability and intelligence, and Svathilfari's strength and dedication, but he had also developed qualities that were uniquely his own, traits that quickly drew the attention of the most powerful god in Asgard. Odin had always been fascinated by horses. From his high seat, Halidskielf, he could observe all the 9 worlds, and he had seen countless steeds throughout the ages. The wild herds of Midgard, with their fierce independence, the elegant mounts of the light elves with their otherworldly grace, even the skeletal horses that carried the dishonored dead through the darkest realms. But he had never seen anything like Sleipnir. The Allfather began visiting the young horse regularly, always with some reasonable excuse. He might be checking on how well the newcomer was adapting to Asgard, or ensuring that Loki had everything needed for his son's care, but anyone who watched carefully could see that Odin's interest went far deeper than mere courtesy or concern. Sleipnir seemed to understand this attention in ways that surprised everyone, including Loki. When Odin approached, the young horse would lift his head with an alertness that suggested recognition of something important. He would stand perfectly still while the god examined his conformation, his breathing steady and calm even when those intense divine eyes studied every detail of his impossible anatomy. You could see Odin's fascination growing with each visit. The way Sleipnir moved suggested capabilities that exceeded even divine imagination. Those 8 legs didn't just provide stability and speed. They seemed to offer the possibility of traveling in ways that ordinary horses or even ordinary magic couldn't achieve. There was something in the young stallion's bearing that spoke of journeys not just across vast distances but between realms, through barriers that normally stopped even gods. During one of these visits, Odin asked Loki about Sleipnir's lineage, though he already knew the answer. The trickster's response was careful, measured, carrying undertones of both pride and protective concern. His father was Thil Fari, Loki said. You saw what that horse could accomplish. But Sleipnir is more than just his father's son. He carries possibilities that I'm still discovering. What Loki didn't say, but what Odin understood perfectly, was that Sleipnir represented something unprecedented in the 9 worlds. Here was a creature born from shapeshifting magic, divine will, and circumstances that could never be repeated. His very existence was unique, and his potential was correspondingly limitless. As Sleipnir grew, and he grew remarkably quickly, even by divine standards, his capabilities became increasingly apparent. He could run faster than wind, his 8 legs carrying him at speeds that made other horses look motionless by comparison. But more than that, he seemed able to find paths where no paths existed, to cross terrain that should have been impossible for any earthbound creature. One morning, several of the gods witnessed something that changed their understanding of what Sleipnir might become. The young horse was running in the meadows beyond Asgard's walls, his 8 legs creating complex rhythms that somehow resolved into pure poetry of motion. As they watched, he approached a cliff that dropped away into misty depths, and instead of stopping, he kept running, his hooves finding purchase on the air itself. For long moments, Sleipnir galloped through empty sky, as if it were solid ground, his mane and tail streaming behind him like silver banners. Then, with the casual ease of someone stepping off a curb, he descended back to earth and continued his run as if nothing extraordinary had happened. That display of impossible ability sealed something in Odin's mind. This was not just a remarkable horse. This was a mount worthy of the king of gods, a companion who could carry divine will into realms and situations where even Odin's ravens feared to go. But how could he possibly ask Loki to give up such a magnificent son? The answer came in a way that surprised everyone involved. It was Sleipnir himself who made the choice, displaying an understanding of destiny that seemed to exceed his apparent youth. You could see it in the way he began gravitating toward Odin during the god's visits, in how he would position himself to be easily seen from the Allfather's favorite windows. And Loki, observant as always, recognized what was happening. His son was choosing his own path, drawn by instincts that went deeper than family loyalty or personal preference. Sleipnir had been born for a purpose, and that purpose was calling to him through his connection to the most powerful god in Asgard. The conversation between Loki and Odin, when it finally came, was both formal and deeply personal. They met in Odin's private chambers, away from the curious eyes of other gods, surrounded by the artifacts and memories of countless divine adventures. The Allfather's request was carefully worded, acknowledging both Sleipnir's value and Loki's sacrifice in even considering such a gift. I would be honored to serve as Sleipnir's rider, Odin said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity, but only if you believe it serves his highest purpose, and only if he chooses it freely. Loki's response came after long consideration, his shapeshifter's understanding of identity and transformation informing his decision. He was born from sacrifice, the trickster said finally. Perhaps it's fitting that his path should involve service to the greater good, but the choice must be his. And so they put the question to Sleipnir himself, though not in words. Odin approached the young stallion with bridle and saddle crafted specifically for his unique form. eight-legged tack that was itself a work of art, created by the finest craftsmen in all the realms. When he offered these symbols of partnership rather than ownership, Sleipnir stepped forward without hesitation, lowering his head to accept the bridle with a dignity that made the ceremony feel like a coronation rather than a transaction. And so Sleipnir became Odin's mount. Though mount seems too simple a word for what they became together, you might say they were partners in the truest sense. God and horse united in purpose and possibility, ready to travel farther and faster than anyone had ever gone before. Their first journey together was a revelation that changed both rider and horse forever. Odin had planned a simple circuit of the 9 worlds. Nothing too ambitious, just a chance to test Sleipnir's abilities and begin building the trust that would be essential for their future adventures. But from the moment Sleipnir's 8 hooves left the ground of Asgard, it became clear that they were capable of something far beyond ordinary travel. Picture them rising above the gleaming halls of the god's realm, Sleipnir's legs finding purchase on currents of air and possibility that only he could perceive. Odin sat easily on his back, feeling the incredible smoothness of a gait that distributed motion across 8 perfectly coordinated limbs. There was no jarring, no discomfort, just the sensation of flying while still somehow running. They descended first toward Midgard, the world of humans, where Odin often went to observe mortal struggles and achievements, but where such journeys had once required careful use of the Rainbow Bridge or complex magical preparations. Sleipnir simply galloped through the sky as if space itself were solid ground beneath his hooves. You could have watched from below and seen them pass overhead like a storm cloud with purpose, moving at speeds that made distance meaningless. Sleipnir's 8 legs created a rhythm unlike anything that had ever existed, not the simple 4-beat cadence of ordinary horses, but something far more complex and musical, as if he were drumming out melodies on the fabric of reality itself. From Midgard, they traveled to Jotunheim, the realm of giants, where massive beings dwelt in halls carved from living mountains. Here, Sleipnir's abilities proved even more remarkable. When they needed to cross a chasm that yawned between 2 peaks, he simply galloped across the emptiness, his hooves striking sparks from the air as if it were stone. The giants who witnessed their passage stood in amazement, these beings who thought themselves the masters of impossible size and strength. But here was something that dwarfed their achievements not through mere magnitude, but through the elegant transcendence of natural law. Sleipnir wasn't just big, he was beyond the normal rules that governed movement and possibility. Their journey continued to Alfheim, where the light elves dwelt in their crystal cities that caught and reflected starlight in ways that made them seem to exist partially in dreams. Even these masters of ethereal magic stopped their eternal dances to watch Sleipnir pass, his grey coat seeming to absorb and redistribute their impossible colours in patterns that created new forms of beauty. In Svartalfheim, the dark elves and dwarfs emerged from their underground forges to witness the passage of something that moved faster than their swiftest arrows, more gracefully than their most delicate mechanisms. Sleipnir's hoofbeats echoed through their tunnels and caverns, creating harmonies that their master craftsmen tried desperately to capture and recreate in metal and stone. But it was when they reached the more dangerous realms that Sleipnir's true value became apparent. In Muspelheim, where flames danced in eternal celebration of destruction, his hooves seemed immune to heat that would have melted ordinary iron. He galloped across seas of lava as easily as meadow grass, his 8 legs distributing his weight so perfectly that he barely disturbed the molten surface. Niflheim, the world of ice and primal cold, proved equally passable, where other horses would have slipped and fallen on the eternal glaciers. Sleipnir's multiple hooves found purchase that defied explanation. He ran up vertical ice walls, across chasms filled with howling wind, through blizzards that would have blinded and frozen any other traveler. The most remarkable part of their journey came when they visited Helheim, the realm of the dead, where Odin's own daughter Hel ruled over those who had died of sickness or age rather than in battle. This was a place that living beings entered only under the most extraordinary circumstances, separated from the world of life by barriers that even gods respected. But Sleipnir carried Odin across those boundaries, as if they were merely suggestions rather than absolute laws. His 8 legs seemed to drum out rhythms that convinced reality itself to step aside, creating passages where none had existed, finding roads that led between life and death without forcing the travelers to choose between them. In Helheim, they encountered Hel herself, Loki's daughter who ruled with wisdom born from understanding both life and death. She watched her nephews approach with eyes that held centuries of judgment, but when she saw how Sleipnir moved, with respect for her realm but without fear of its nature, she nodded in approval. Uncle's son runs well, she said to Odin, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. He moves between worlds as easily as others walk between rooms. You have chosen your mount wisely, All-Father. Their return journey to Asgard took them through Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods who had once been enemies but were now allies. Here, Sleipnir's abilities took on yet another dimension. He seemed to understand not just the physical geography of the realms, but their emotional and spiritual landscapes as well. His path through Vanaheim followed routes that honored old treaties and ancient wisdom, showing respect for powers that existed long before the current age of gods. As they approached the familiar walls of Asgard, both horse and rider had been changed by their journey. Odin now understood that he possessed not just a remarkable mount, but a partner who could carry divine will into places and situations that had previously been beyond reach. With Sleipnir, the boundaries between worlds became merely suggestions, the impossible became routine, and the scope of what could be achieved expanded beyond previous imagination. Sleipnir, for his part, had discovered his true purpose. He wasn't just fast or strong or magical. He was a bridge between realities, a living connection that could unite the scattered realms of existence. His 8 legs didn't just carry him across distance, but across the fundamental divisions that separated one kind of reality from another. When they landed in Asgard's courtyard, Loki was waiting for them. The trickster's expression showed pride mixed with something that might have been loss, the recognition that his son had found his destiny, even though it meant their relationship would necessarily change. "How was the journey?" Loki asked, his voice carefully casual. Odin dismounted with the slow movements of someone still processing an extraordinary experience. "Your son," he said formally, "has capabilities that exceed even my understanding. He doesn't just travel between worlds, he makes the journey itself into something new." Sleipnir stood between them, his 8 legs perfectly balanced, his grey coat still shimmering with reflections of the 9 worlds they had visited. In his dark eyes you could see depths that spoke of distances travelled not just in space but in understanding. He had become something more than the sum of his impossible heritage. He had become the fastest horse in all existence, capable of carrying gods and messages, and hope itself across any barrier that might attempt to divide the worlds. And so, our tales of the 8-legged horse come to an end, though his story was really just beginning. From that first journey forward, Sleipnir would carry Odin on missions that shaped the fate of gods and mortals alike. He would gallop across the battlefield of Ragnarok, race against time itself to deliver crucial messages, and serve as a living reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary solutions come from the most unexpected circumstances. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine the sound of 8 hooves finding rhythm in the darkness above your roof. Not frightening, but comforting, like knowing that somewhere in the vast spaces between worlds, swift help travels on paths that connect all things to all other things, and maybe in your dreams you'll glimpse a grey horse with starlight in his mane, carrying hopes and messages across distances that would otherwise remain forever unbridged. The stories of gods and horses and shapeshifters remind us that transformation is always possible, that dedication can accomplish impossible things, and that sometimes our greatest gifts come from our willingness to become something we never expected to be. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere, swift hooves still drum out rhythms of possibility in the spaces between the worlds.